recording now-ish. Perfect. So my name is Seth Snoap, he, him, his, from Holland, Michigan. I am the Menace Allies Coordinator at Resilience. Yeah, Brad, you want to introduce yourself?
Hey everybody, my name is Brad Hefia, he, him, his pronouns as well, and I am a trauma therapist at Resilience Advocates for Ending Violence in Holland.
Awesome. Thanks for being with us, Brad. I know your voice and input last conversation was awesome. Also, our moderator and my colleague Leslie will also be joining in the conversation in a little bit, just because today we're going to be talking about consent, and obviously consent is taught differently between men and women, and we're going to take a look at that, why they're different, and all that fun stuff. But I just want to give a couple shout outs. We have a lot of people here today, which is awesome. A lot of people from all over. We have a lot of West Michigan folks. So welcome. We have some colleagues from the Children Advocacy Center. We have some people from San Jose I saw, which is awesome. Muskegon County. So thank you. This is awesome. I'm really excited to continue this conversation. And so before we get started talking about consent, I want to go over last week a little bit. And so I want to ask, how does consent connect to the man box? Why does this conversation need to follow what we talked about last week? And what we talked about last week is the man box, or the collective socialization of manhood, right? The society's how-to manual for guys. It's how to be a real man 101, right? And in that conversation, we talked about how most of the time that very, very rigid, narrow way of thinking is most often unhealthy, and really detrimental to men's mental health and overall relationship with others. So yeah, Brad, I guess I'm going to ask you the first question. So why should we be talking about consent in terms of the man box?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, so many things in life, there's a gender component to it, and consent is no different. There are like different rules when we look at consent and gender, and it's very unhealthy and it's very destructive. And I think we're going to look at some statistics in a bit, but when we look at especially sexual assault, and we see that, over 90% of perpetrators are men, there's clearly something wrong with manhood and consent, and we really need to have that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And so with this as a logical next step, I'm going to ask this. How many of us know what consent means? You can just do like a raise a hand, or just say, oh, I do, in the chat. But I'm pretty sure most of us, yeah, see, I'm getting thumbs up board. Most of us know what consent means. And so I'm going to ask you this, Brad. When was the first time you ever heard of the concept consent?
Oh, it's a question that you would hope you would know, like, and say it was really young. But for me, I had a really hard time pinpointing when the first time I actually like thought about consent. It might have been like junior or senior year in high school, for like our sex education class, which was more just like health class than anything else. Um, and that really bothers me, that I was maybe 17, 18 years old, and I learned about it, but I didn't really learn about it at the same time. Like, it was just, here's the definition and move on. So it's really a shame that for me, it took 18 years. It wasn't until college, when I actually started to want to know more about this, that I found out more and more and more about consent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to pose this question to the audience now. When was your first time hearing about consent? And so you can type in the chat a little example. But I know when I kind of had a similar experience to you, Brad, but it was slightly younger. I think it was 8th grade in middle school. And it was a health class where we would half the time go up to the gym and then half the time sit down and talk about, reproductive health and all of that. And like you said, it was like a one-time conversation, and it was like everyone was super uncomfortable. No one wanted to talk about it. The teacher definitely didn't want to talk about it, and no one wanted to ask questions. We basically like flew through it and then said, all right, we're good. Yeah, we know consent, right? And so, yeah, a lot of people are saying the same thing. 18 wasn't even mentioned in my sex ed class. 8th grade year, sex education class. A lot of people are saying not until college. So even later in life, early 20s, probably as an adult, and no discussion surrounding consent. They probably show the consent T video, which I love. I love that video. I use it all the time. But basically, they show the video and say, all right, we're good to go. You get it, right? Post-grad, I was definitely taught how not to get raped, but not how to actively say yes or what it meant. Yeah, and we're going to kind of unpack that a little bit. And so my question is, after this one-time conversation, have any of you ever talked about consent since? So if it was for 8th grade or 18 or post-grad or as an adult, is it just a one-time conversation and then done? Or have you had that conversation about consent? Because consent changes over our lives, right? As our relationships change, consent also changes. So Brad, you probably have talked about consent more than once, but
Yeah, like I said, in college, I started to want to know more. So had I not made that decision, though, I don't know if I would have, to be honest, have learned more about it. But I took a sex education class in college, and it was just mind blowing how in depth we went with consent. I thought it was like a simple yes or no. When high school, that's kind of what we were taught. Something verbal, it was either yes or no. And in college, it just broke down. There's so many layers to it. There's so many ways that people can give or withdraw consent. Consent isn't just sexual. There's so many other things in life that you can consent to or not consent to. And it was just this like mind blowing idea that my whole life, consent has been a part of it, and yet no one's really talked about it or identified it. So I'd say in college, it really started to wake me up to, we got to change the system here that teaches consent as a simple, yes or no in high school.
yeah, oh, absolutely. I ran into the same thing a little bit later. We had that 8th grade talk, consent is yes or no, and then I went all the way up into college. And then in college, I played college football, and I was in a fraternity. And every semester, we would have like a recap. And so we would have like a consent and risk management recap to basically say, hey, you're on a higher pedestal now. This is what consent looks like. But it still wasn't to the depth you were describing. It was still, hey, here's a consentee video. It's yes or no. And so I never had that deep conversation about consent until probably like junior or senior year of college. And you're absolutely right. And we're going to kind of get into that and get into why consent should be a deeper conversation than just it's yes or no, right? And so I guess the next kind of question I want to ask is, in your own words, Brad, or Leslie, you can chime in as well whenever you want. What is the definition of consent?
Yeah, it's one of those things that it's very complex. So there's multiple definitions to it, and I think for a lot of people we struggle with that because we're kind of taught, especially in our society, like things are binary. It's either this or it's this, and we don't like gray. And believe it or not, like consent, it is gray. It's not just verbal, it's nonverbal. It's not just sexual, but it's all things in life. It's body, autonomy. You have the right to either engage in something or not engage in something. You have the right to start to engage and then change your mind
Mhm.
and say, "Nah, I'm done," and you can withdraw that consent.
Right.
And so there's so many layers to it. It's not a simple yes or no. It's not verbal all the time, but it's like a feeling that a lot of people, they kind of know what that's like. They can read the cues. It's good to also talk about it and have that communication, but it's also something that can be withdrawn at any moment, and that really needs to be talked about too.
Absolutely. Leslie, anything to add, or
Yeah,
was
for
that
sure.
good?
No, it's great. And I opened it up for the chat. Anyone can feel free to join in and write what consent means to you. Obviously, we know it should be willing and mutual and enthusiastic, and it's not about if it's not consensual if my partner has fallen silent, if they stop reciprocating, if they go quiet, if they're not sure. An unsure response, and I don't know, is a no. And so really understanding what consent means. I certainly didn't grow up understanding all of that. I think we are inundated with messages about what, like, I saw Kelly in the chat say, messages about don't get assaulted, don't be raped. And for many female identified folks or others might feel like they're told, be on the defensive, fend it off, be ready because it's inevitable. Like an assault is inevitable. So that idea of consent is, the messages around it have been, it's about the other person initiating it, and then you're supposed to decide whether you want to go along with it or not. And that's a very unhealthy message. That it's meant to be mutual. It's meant to be something that both parties are taking part in and want to participate in. So yeah, it definitely should be enthusiastic and willing and mutual, and not something you're just trying to go along with because you're not really sure what to do. That's not consent.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both. And clearly, we can see that consent is a much more complex thing than the yes or no we're taught in 8th grade sex ed class. And so I actually looked up the Webster's definition of consent. And so it actually says the definition of consent is permission for something to happen or agreement to do something. Or to consent to something means you confidently agree to it based on your own free will without any pressure or influence. And my next question is that enough? Is that enough to describe consent? And clearly, from what everyone's been saying and what both of you have been saying, it's not. And yet this is what is taught in 8th grade health class or sex education in college or high school. And so my next question for you, Brad, or myself, is why do we as a society basically have that one-time conversation about consent and then think it's good? Because clearly it's not. I mean, if you look at the statistics about sexual assaults and sexual harassment, like, this is a problem, and people are just not understanding what consent is and what consent looks like. So why do we keep pushing that one-time conversation, for me in 8th grade, or one-time conversation in sex ed class, and then basically slap a sticker on it and say, good to go, we did it, check, next.
I think that's a great point, because it's not enough just to have a one-time conversation, but yet that's the way it is across all states, really. Like the way the sex education system is built, it's not to talk about these topics. And there's a reason, right? That's not random. That's not a coincidence. And this is why it's so important to tie in the man box to this and kind of the system, patriarchy, male dominance. And really what that is, men are taught that we are superior and that women are not necessarily human beings with a voice, with autonomy, but they're more objects for us to please us, especially sexually. The sexual objectification of women's bodies is maybe the pillar to all of this. And sex sells in our country like no other. And so we see it through media, magazines, TV, all of the advertisements and products. It's through this male gaze, is what they call it. And so if we don't teach consent, especially to women and men, then the system can kind of keep going that will objectify women's bodies and that will give privilege to men, that will allow them to feel like they're in control. It's about them, they're superior, and the system just keeps going. Male privilege, patriarchy. And I think the system is a big reason why we don't have these conversations.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear maybe what Leslie or what you have to say too.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I always like your perspective of looking at like the systems involved. I really respect that. I was thinking more along the lines, I'm going to be honest, talking about consent can get awkward, right? Just because we don't have these conversations often enough to make it normalized. I know whenever I do either a live respect lesson or a CBIM lesson, a courting boys and men lesson about consent or understanding sexual assault, understanding sexual harassment, everyone is like on their tippy toes, like everyone's uncomfortable besides me, the person who has all these conversations often enough to say, no, we're going to normalize talking about consent. And so even, and Stephen was going to join in. Even he was a little nervous to talk about consent just because, and he was one of our main speakers. And he was even nervous, like I said, and it's completely normal, but I think we just need to start to normalize having consent talks often and naturally, and organically. Like if we're hanging out, just talk about, hey, like this happened to me today. Why or why not? Like let's tie that into consent. Something like just stuff like that. And then I'm gonna read off a few answers in the chat. And I do appreciate all of you taking the time to talk with us. It's really awesome to have more than just Brad and I and Leslie talking. So while most often consent is spoken about in the context of sexual relations, more commonly though, it is a principle that plays out in all aspects of one's relationship with another. Consent should be an ongoing value we hold at all times with others. And this really stuck out to me because we're going to talk about that. We're going to, a little bit later in the conversation, we're going to talk about what does consent really look like in our day-to-day lives, because like you just said, it's not just a romantic relationship. Consent is needed in all forms of relationships. So yeah, thank you for that. I really respect you for bringing that up. So next, and just like you were saying, Brad, about media and porn and where we get it, if we have these one-time conversations, or if we don't have these conversations until we're in high school or in college, where do we learn about consent? Where do we learn these things that go into the man box? Kind of like what we talked about last week, is where our definition of consent comes from, right? And so what I want to do is I want to talk to specifically the male identified, or the guys right now. Where do we guys basically learn what consent means? And Brad, you can start, I can start. But I think a big teacher of what consent is or is not only is the man box, but I think is porn. More than often, consent conversations lead to a conversation about porn, especially with like my middle schoolers and high schoolers. It almost always leads to this. And it's just because it's so readily available. It's right in the palm of your hand, and it's so normalized, which can be kind of very destructive to a developing mind like that, because porn is so addicting. And what I always ask them is, okay, so you watch it, count how many times you have seen or heard consent in porn, and they can't, because porn is all about the degradation of women, the violent tendencies, and the domination by men. And so I think that's a big factor in this, is what porn is teaching and how porn is rewiring young men's brains to think about consent and think about healthy romantic relationships.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think young men, young boys are being exposed to mainstream porn a lot younger than we would like to think, that we want to admit. You know, it's probably like elementary school, the first time they're seeing some pornographic images, and there's a lot of like clickbait going on in YouTube. You might be watching something completely innocent, but the advertisement is very sexualized, or this link. So that certainly is huge. I think another thing too is a little bit more subtle, but even like Disney movies, like old Disney movies. I know, like Sleeping Beauty, right?
Right.
Prince Charming has to like kiss her while she's unconscious. That's not consent.
Yeah.
All right? That is assault. And yet it's one of the most popular Disney movies.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like this idea of men needing to be Prince Charming, and women are always this damsel in distress. And like, if we can save the day, like, then we get the reward, you know? And there's no conversation there. There's no communication there. It's all part of this manhood idea of I'm in control, I'm in charge, I initiate. We see it in porn, we see it in film, we see it in even kids movies. And that's what's so problematic about this, is it's threaded throughout all of our culture. And it's really impactful, especially for young people that are growing up and developing.
Yeah, absolutely. I like how you bring up even Disney movies. Like, I love Disney movies, but still it's those underlying themes of consent and those things that kids do pick up on these things. And so how are they supposed to process what they see if we're not allowing them to talk about what they see? And this all just comes back to the man box and the rules and expectations that are forced upon guys. Like you're saying, like, guys have to make the first move. Guys have to be spontaneous. They have to be dominating. They have to be sexually promiscuous. All of that stuff. Someone said James Bond. Absolutely. Right. I love the Bond films, but not a great model of what consent should be. Little Mermaid, Kiss the Girl, right? The song isn't first asked to kiss, then kiss. It's just kiss the girl. And last one is Good Boys was a film released last year that showed a lot of things we're talking about. Young boys resorting to the internet to learn about kissing and relations, right? When we don't have these kind of conversations with young men and boys, they learn it from media, porn, older brothers, all of these kind of outside influences, which we talked about last week, that aren't necessarily the healthiest, right? So yeah, thank you.
Hey, Seth.
So now, ladies.
I wanted to add to the conversation what I've been thinking about since you asked me yesterday about consent, and I started thinking about the social norms and the peer norms around dancing, and particularly when, school dances, and then as we grow up and I went to like college parties and later to clubs and things, and just going out dancing with friends. And the norms around dancing and how consent plays into that, and particularly around the kind of like grinding dancing, and sort of the rules that you buy into are, so I'm dancing with my friends, and if someone comes up behind me, like they can just do that. There's no eye contact, there's no ask of consent, but the social norm, the way that that goes, is I'm either supposed to just go along with it or tell that person no. And I can speak for myself, and I'm sure others have had that experience, where I've had countless experiences. I thought of at least 5 different experiences where I had to like get someone away, and just the like, that's a pure norm, a norm of this is how we dance, this is how we hang out together. And I remember one particular time when I was married. I was like, I got married at 23. I was going out with my sister and a huge group of friends, and we went dancing. And I remember dancing with my sister and her husband at the time, and this random guy comes up behind me, and I have to like tell him no, and he looked confused, like, what do you mean no? I'm like, no. And then I just held up my ring, which this isn't the reason why he shouldn't do it. I use it as a defense mechanism, but he assumed it was okay, and I had to like get him away. So just what we're used to around consent, what we buy into as a social norm, consent has been omitted from that conversation of like asking someone to dance, making eye contact, and making sure that that's an okay interaction with that person, not just having contact without consent.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'm going to ask you to elaborate on one thing, but I'm going to pose this question to the female identified in this conversation. What were you taught about consent? And I'm going to bring it back to you, Leslie, when you talked about it's almost like I forget how you were putting it, but it's almost like you have to fend guys off, right? That's your job, to fend guys off. And so could you elaborate more on that? Just because as a guy, I've never had that conversation before. So it's just interesting to look at the differences between how men are taught consent and how women are taught consent, and the norms behind the two, right?
And I think the stereotypes or the things we are taught are very heteronormative. So that's kind of the binary that we're speaking in. But anyone who is the pursuer and anyone who is the recipient of that attention, affection, or action, like that applies to all people, no matter our identity. So I can't speak for all women, and I certainly wouldn't try to. But we all kind of experience that. I think about, I'll just give some examples, like things that we were taught. It was definitely like, you're not the one to ask somebody out. And there's all these names, like you're considered loose, or I won't even say all the things that women are called, or anyone is called, if you are too forward. And so like we have to deal with that. And so there's very like heteronormative things, like the guy is supposed to make the first move. I just think that that's what we learn and we grow up with. Schools around here have dealt with a lot of yoga pant issues, where they've developed dress codes, and issues of girls being grabbed in the hallway, and just how consent is seen as not understanding that there's no consent there, just because of what someone wears, no matter how tight, no matter what it looks like, but there's no consent for grabbing that individual. And then dress codes are being edited and changed because girls shouldn't wear yoga pants. And so just that is an example of taking it into a policy based on a negative norm, like there's no consent there. But I think we're inundated with negative messages that it's your fault, you have to fight it off, it's expected, and girls, like traditionally, and girls aren't expected to make the first move in a relationship or a dating situation. Hopefully those things are becoming less, like breaking down and becoming more mutual, that it's consent is about mutuality and both showing affection toward each other, and that we're getting to a place where there's a lot more equality in that relationship, and initiating affection and contact is changing and becoming more mutual and equal.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate how you bring up the, like, just randomly touching in the hallway because of the yoga pants. I know one person kind of said something to that degree. In my experience, guys also felt like because I agreed to dance, that means it also is okay to touch me. Clearly, those are two very different things. And so before we kind of talk about the next question, the one thing I see as a really big disparity is within consent. It's essentially we're teaching female identified people to say, basically, well, if you're wearing yoga pants, do something about it. Instead of teaching guys, no, ask consent, right? We're putting all of the responsibility and the blame on female identified to say, well, it's you were asking for it, right? And then that leads to victim blaming culture. And so we have a really good question. I totally agree with what you're saying on dance culture, but how do we change that? How do we begin to unravel that kind of unhealthy culture within dance culture, which this kind of leads us into our next portion of our conversation. How do we begin to, specifically in dance culture, how do we begin to change that to become healthier and filled with more consent?
Well, I think one thing that kind of ties into a lot of what we're saying right now is the hypersexualization of women's bodies or female identified bodies, right? And the sexual objectification that goes along with that. And so, right, manhood, like men are taught that the woman's body is there to give them pleasure, essentially, like that's the root of this. And so what happens is, like, and to Leslie's point, like policies and all of these things are developed around you shouldn't be tempting boys and men, you shouldn't be distracting boys and men. And so if you're dancing and you're wearing revealing clothing, like, you obviously are looking for sexual attention. And we really have to abolish this system that objectifies women's bodies. It dehumanizes them. It takes away their voice, their autonomy, and it strips them down to just being a physical body. And also we have to abolish this tendency, this practice from men and boys especially, that hypersexualizes anything that is remotely close to a woman's figure or body, hips, breasts, all of those things. It's not there. It doesn't exist. A woman's body or a female identified body does not exist just to give you pleasure. And I think that's a foundational piece of this man box that we have to abolish. We can't reform this from the ground up. This has to go. No more objectification, no more hypersexualization.
Absolutely. I was snapping that whole time because I loved it. I like how you brought it back to basically the roots of it all. And I love looking at the roots behind the things, behind the issues. And I like how you say, no, we're not here to reform the man box. We're here to abolish the man box and the unhealthy teachings. So this kind of leads us into we talked about where we learned consent. We talked about what consent kind of looks like between male identified and female identified. But now I want to talk about just generalization. What does consent look like? And so what we're going to talk about first is, what does it look like in a romantic relationship? And then next, what does it look like in a friendship? Kind of like what was talked about earlier about consent is all encompassing. It doesn't just mean consent within romantic relationships. It needs to be used everywhere. And then what does consent look in your workplace? So yeah, and I posed this question to all of you in the chat. What does consent look like in a romantic relationship? And so what I always teach the boys I talk to is basically I say you need to get an enthusiastic verbal yes. And that's when they're always like, oh man, like, but you're trying to be smooth, and like that ruins the mood. And I'm like, no. Like, just because it's not normalized in society's eyes does not mean it's not smooth. Like, what I always tell them is, if you want to push things forward, stop. And before you push things forward, stop and ask consent. And so if you're asking consent 3 or 4 times during this entire experience or this entire situation, good. You're both on the same page. And then I tell them, and don't get upset when they don't want to push it forward. Just be happy that you're together, right? And we just lost power. So we're having a really bad thunderstorm and our lights are going. So yeah, wish us luck. But yeah, that's essentially what I teach my boys. And then I always use that example of, even with my wife, I still ask for her consent, right? I ask for her consent if we want to cuddle. I ask for her consent if we want to kiss. I ask for her consent if we want to do anything else. Just because she's my wife does not mean that consent is applied. And yeah, so that's what consent looks like in my kind of romantic relationships. Yeah, anything to add, Brad?
Yeah, I love that. I agree with that as well. I think too, like reframing, like you said, when you're talking to these young men and they're like, oh man, that's not smooth, that's awkward. So we have to reframe this, right? Consent is sexy, right? If we can reframe it as something like that, right? It's sexual activity should be about mutual pleasure. And that's hot. That's great. Like that's important. That's healthy. And we don't attach those positives to consent. We just make it feel like it's work or it's a requirement. But it's actually, it builds relationships. You're taking someone's voice and their thoughts, and you're respecting them. You're doing mutual trust. You're going to have a stronger, healthier relationship if you're not only asking for consent, but then you're also checking in. And I am a huge fan of check-ins during anything. You say okay to start, but then you don't really know how is it going to feel once you start or in the middle or towards the end. So you constantly need to check in, especially if things are changing, if maybe it's getting a little bit more intense or passionate. Like, is this okay? How are you feeling? Does this sound like something you would like? Constantly checking in. Just because you got a yes at first, that's great and that's important, but you also have to have that throughout the entire act, right? So normalizing check-ins, and then also making it positive. It's healthy, it's beautiful, it's sexy. It's a trait of a good partner, and we should all strive to do that and be that. I think that could go a long way too.
Absolutely. It builds that foundation of respect and communication in a relationship that everybody wants to have in a relationship, right? And this brings me back to dance culture too. These same rules apply to dance culture. And I work with a fraternity on Hope College campus. And I talk to them about consent before their 2 weeks straight of partying. And so I talk to them about consent and what consent looks like on the dance floor. And I always tell them, you know what? Don't just be grabbing on the dance floor. Like we were saying, don't just reach out and grab. Face the person you want to dance with, look them in the eye and say, hey, do you want to dance with me? If they say no, awesome. If they say yes, awesome. It's just that level of respect. And also, I love what was just added. It's also sober, which is a big one. I also always teach, if any substance is in the body, you cannot get consent. It's just, that's a fact. That's a fact that I say. That's a fact that a lot of people say. If there are some substances involved, whatever they may be, you cannot get consent. And so, yeah, Leslie, do you have anything to add on consent in romantic relationships, or no? Awesome. So
can I add something?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Hey, everybody, this is Josue with the Call to Men. I think one of the things that we see that we're up against is this culture that young boys, young men are taught that no means try harder, right?
Yeah.
So that's something that we're always trying to like shift by modeling healthy forms of manhood, of masculinity. When we rolled out the Live Respect curriculum a few years ago, we did a pre-survey with like 300 middle school and high school boys. And what we got was 41% of them believed that once they engaged in a sexual activity with a young woman, that they didn't have a right to change their mind, right? And then 81% of them believe that, or not believe, but 81% admitted to not even knowing how to define consent. So I think, you know, a lot of the points that y'all are raising, that media plays a role, but it's also like the teachings, right, from brothers and fathers, and that's why it's important to just model it as best we can, because that, for me personally, I didn't have models of healthy masculinity and manhood in my life, right? Now that I do know that, as much as I can is modeling that for other folks, right? So if it's like the men in my life or my coworkers in my life, being able to have those uncomfortable conversations, right? Because it does take that to shift the culture, right? Because what we are talking about here is shifting the culture, and that's not easy. But so I appreciate this conversation. I just wanted to add those pieces.
Oh, thank you so much. Totally, just with all of what we're talking about, totally like that statement, like, oh, they're just playing hard to get, right? Like, oh no, she just said no, but she's just playing hard to get. I heard that a lot in high school, and that boggles my mind now that I understand consent more. And I love what you said about be that model. Be that model of what healthy manhood looks like, what healthy consent looks like. Thank you. And thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. So my next question is, what does consent look like between friends? If we are going to talk about an all-encompassing consent, what does that look like in a friendship?
I have an idea. So again, as a therapist, like mental health is really important to me. And I know that with friends, one of the like expectations is, as a friend, like you're supposed to listen to me, like when I'm having a bad day. You're supposed to be there for me and give me emotional support. And so I'm going to vent all of my problems because I need to get that out. And I'm going to put that on you. And there's just an expectation. There isn't a, hey, how's your mental health? Is it safe for me to unload on you? There's no conversation there. You just do it because you're friends. And I think consent's really important there, because not everyone has the capacity to take other people's pain and add it to their shoulders and the weight that they're feeling. And mental health is something that everybody struggles with, especially in our culture, but very rarely do we get the support that we need. So I would say consent, especially before you just unload with your friends, check in on them. Is it a good day to do that? Did they have a tough day too? Do you need to edit what you're about to say and maybe not be so detailed? Are they survivors of trauma? Do they have some triggers that you should be aware of? So before you do that, having conversation, getting consent, are they in a good place so that you can, have that communication? That's really important to me personally.
Absolutely. Thank you. One person said, with friends, we can be proactive about telling others what being respected looks like to me and asking in turn what being respected looks like to them. Yeah, it's like you were saying, Brad, have those authentic conversations, but even before having those authentic conversations, ask for consent to have those authentic conversations. Because sometimes, like, I'll use a personal example. I'm an open book. And my wife knows this as well. I got her consent to talk about this. But sometimes I'm having a terrible day. And I don't have the mental capacity to be that listening ear, to be fully present when my wife wants to come talk to me about some heavy stuff. And I straight up tell her, I'm like, look, I can't be that listening ear that you want me to be right now. Let me do some self-care and then check out like later. And so it's all about that foundation of respect, which you need in romantic relationships, but you also need in those friendships, because friends aren't supposed to be garbage disposals that you just toss all your junk on. There's supposed to be a mutual communication of struggles and vulnerability, but make sure that you're ready to have those conversations. And with my high school and middle school boys and girls, I always ask before we even talk about vulnerability or kind of some heavier stuff. I always ask, hey, like, if you're in the headspace to talk about this, if not, just let me know and you can like take a step out, or you can sit in the back and just listen to what I have to say. You don't have to add to the conversation. But that foundation of respect is huge in relationships. Anything else you would like to add, Leslie?
Yeah, I was thinking about how we teach consent with kids. And I know we have some of our partners on here from the Children's Advocacy Center and other agencies around the country who do this work with young people. And I go back to our therapy team uses this, and my husband used this when he was an elementary school teacher of second and first graders. And then he was a assistant principal of an elementary school. When students leave a classroom or for the day, you might say high five, hug, or bump, fist bump, and just a way to get their consent about how to say goodbye. And they have a choice. They get to decide what that contact looks like. And the idea is we want to love kids. We want to show them affection. They don't always get that at home. And so the idea is to give them that affection and attention, but to also, and they can say no, of course, but they also get a choice about what that looks like. Some kids need a hug, want a hug, other like a good safe side hug, or a fist bump or something to their comfort level. And I think that is definitely a part of the conversation of consent, is how we do that with really young kids and how we teach consent throughout the lifespan. And if others want to chime in on that, I know many of you do that work. We'd love to hear from you also.
Absolutely.
I just want to lift up what Brad mentioned earlier, just this, we're in a society, right, where we're placing a lot of value on how we expect friends to show up. And we see that, well, I see that, right? And being able to recognize that when it's happening, it's coercion, right? Like, well, you did it last week. Like, why aren't you done this week? You know, or like, just do this for me. My friends do that all the time. You know, they're like, you're not down. You're not down. Come on.
Yeah.
So just being able to recognize, and it's a challenge, right? Because then you're in like a peer kind of pressure situation of wanting to show up how they expect you to show up. So I think that's just a challenge, especially with the young folks, is this coercion that's happening. You know, like keep asking them, keep pressuring them to do it again, right? And it's something that I even still am challenged in my adult life. With my friends, and being able to just set those boundaries and be really clear about like, I am down, but I'm not going to do that for you.
Yeah, I like how you point out like it's all about setting boundaries, right? And I like how you bring up that the next kind of topic I wanted to talk about is non-consent and coercion, right? We've been talking about consent this whole time, but we also have to look at the flip side of that. What does non-consent look like? What does coercion look like? And so I'm going to read something from the chat while you think of examples of what non-consent and coercion look like. But someone in the chat says, I work at Head Start, and a lot of teachers will start the day asking, would you like a hug, high five, or fist bump? Right? Like Leslie was saying. We also have a lot of kids that run and hug everyone, and we try to say each time that they run to a child or adult, make sure you ask them if they want to hug first, right? And so I love that, how you're modeling but also teaching little kids what consent is, even in an elementary school. I love that. So yeah, what does non-consent, what does coercion look like? And if you want to define coercion, go ahead. But what do you think, Brad? What is non-consent? What does coercion look like?
Yeah, so a sexual assault therapist. So I've really heard from my clients and survivors, and non-consent and coercion can look like many things, but there is like an underlying theme. You see a lot where maybe, and we kind of talked about this earlier, there was consent before, and like Josue said, even with friendships, you get that maybe last week, and then there's just this expectation that you've given it forever. And so we see that with marital rape. We see that like, oh, we're going steady, we're dating, so like I don't have to ask for consent anymore. I'll just do, and that's assault, right? There's so many things too, even in relationships where abusers will try and maybe get someone pregnant. They won't pull out, they won't wear protection, they won't wear a condom. That's not a conversation that they had with their partner. They didn't say, hey, you know would you like to try and conceive a child? They just want to do that, they just do it. So it can look like so many things. It can be kind of that image in our mind of like a rape or a sexual assault, but it can also be a little bit more like hidden or implicit, where there's just these little details that you don't get permission for, that you don't ask. And so it can look like a lot of different things, but at the end of the day, it's abuse, it's assault, and it's not okay.
Well said. Thank you. I like how you said the first kind of reaction or first visualization of non-consent and coercion is usually like, oh, that's sexual assault or rape. But a lot of the times it's more implicit, it's more under the radar. It's, like you said, like, but you said you love me, so if you love me, you do this, or like other various things like that. Or you did it last Saturday, why not this Saturday? Or, well, I spent this much money on you, like I need to get something in return, right?
That's huge. Yeah, sexual favors, right? We see that a lot, like quid pro quo, like this for that. I've seen that a lot of the times with people who are co-parenting. They're like, well, you want me to do this for the kid, like you're going to have to give me something in return. And so someone may do that they may sacrifice that because they want their child maybe to be safe or to have resources. And so even if they maybe say, okay, is that really consent, right? And no, you cannot consent if you're being coerced. And so that's an important thing to remember too. So well said.
Anything to add, Leslie?
I think, and this
Talking
kind of
about
goes back,
non-consent.
thank you. Brad covered a lot of it, and this kind of goes back to what Josue said about try harder. The wearing down of someone, like asking over and over until you wear them down and they finally give in. That seems like a very common thing, and something I know I've experienced in the past. I had to actually break up with someone that I dated for 2 weeks, and actually had to like break up with them because of all the pressure, and the pressure, it was too much, and just not respecting boundaries, and just expecting someone to give in is not consent. And so you all said it very well.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's that wearing down. Yeah, I know in high school, I knew people who just said, well, if I keep asking, eventually that no will become a yes, right? And that's just not the way to think about consent. And that's not the way to treat people, is to wear them down until they do something they don't want to do, right? And so I guess consent is complex, right? We've all been talking about it for the last hour. And so I guess why, as a society, why do we think that it's okay to talk about it once? Because clearly most people and a lot of young men don't understand it. And what they're influenced from media to songs to movies to video games, what they're picking up is not what healthy consent looks like. And so what I kind of want to end the conversation is, or how I want to end the conversation is, imagine a world where everyone fully understood consent. So we had these conversations over and over and over, and they talk to their friends. They know what to do on a nightclub dance floor or a frat basement dance floor. They know what to do on a date. They know what consent looks like in a friendship relationship. They know what consent looks like in a romantic relationship. I guess my question is, what would that world look like? What would our relationships look like if everyone in the world fully understood what consent is? If we had these conversations more than one time in eighth grade sex ed class, what would that world look like?
Yeah, I'd love to hear what some people have to say in the chat box, but I'll go ahead and just kind of go back to when I first started talking today about those systems and male privilege. And the reason that men have privilege is because the system exploits women, trans, non-binary folks. It takes theirs away so that, cis hetero men, especially cis hetero white men, can have that privilege. So consent is not important when we think about the system, because it's exploiting people's bodies. And so the system takes their consent away, it takes their voice away, it takes their autonomy away. And so a world that no longer did that, right, it wouldn't have these systemic oppressions and privileges. It would be more about equity and autonomy. Everyone would have a voice and everyone would have power to control their experience instead of having these systems control their experience for them. So I think it's abolishing a lot of those systems of oppression that create a system that exploits women and non-binary folks, trans folks, their bodies for the benefit of cis hetero white men, especially.
Thank you. I think I keep coming back to, ultimately, it would be a society that's based on a foundation of mutual respect for one another and one another's boundaries. A society that's foundation is communication and being able to have these hard conversations in an authentic and vulnerable way. And I think that would be a wonderfully beautiful thing, because a lot of young men, especially who I talk to, have questions about consent. And most of the time, those questions go unanswered. And that's just sad, because we're failing those young men. And then that just leads me to believe, well, if we fail our young men that early, then it's only going to get worse from there, right? And so I think, I like to be a dreamer, because the world I'm imagining is something pretty awesome. And so, yeah. What are your thoughts, Leslie, or anyone in the chat?
Yeah. I want to give props to all those on the call who are doing prevention education, and all the states in this country who are striving to or have passed legislation for consent education, education on sexual assault and dating violence. And not that, well, the hope is that mandating it is going to help standardize it and make it the norm, so that it is taught and we get away from the old school one-time lesson. And I think we are and have been doing that in many communities and states around the country. I want to give props to Jose and a call to men for the Live Respect curriculum. That's a program that we use in our community. And like other programs like Coaching Boys into Men, and others that are focusing on healthy masculinity and healthy manhood, and teaching about bystander education and consent, what sexual assault and dating violence look like, what it looks like to be an ally and that bystander who stands up and holds peers accountable and can speak into those peer situations, whether it's athletics or friend groups or any in the classroom, and hold friends accountable and speak to consent. I have seen that I have young cousins who are in high school, and I hear them talking about and naming, that's not consensual. You know, they are having those conversations with their peers in ways that we didn't when we were younger. So I definitely see things changing, and it's because of these efforts of promoting prevention and talking about primary and secondary prevention, what healthy relationships and consent are and what they look like and should feel like.
Awesome. Thank you so much, both of you, for your input. So I'm going to open up the floor to questions now. Questions from the audience. If you have a question, just type it in the chat. And so we are going to leave about 5 to 10 minutes for questions. So if you have any and anything at all about the topic of consent, please feel free to ask. Yeah, I guess during this time, I have wanted to circle back. I want to reiterate while you're typing in your questions. I just want to reiterate the fact that consent is needed by both, if not all, parties involved. And so, because a lot of the time when I talk about consent, a lot of my young men don't believe that their consent is needed too, which is just wrong. And so it hurts me that that's what we're teaching young men, is that their consent isn't needed, when obviously it's so important for theirs as well. I know a lot of men close to me have struggled with that. Just the fact that their consent was never asked for in certain situations, and how that made them feel. And so there's a lot of unpacking to do with that. But yeah, I guess, Brad, do you have anything to say about male consent as well? I know, like, from my personal experience, I've had to struggle with that. So.
Yeah, I really love that you bring that up because it's so true, right? We've been talking about these expectations based on gender, and there's this expectation that men or male identified people are always consenting to sexual activity, and regardless on how old they are, like they could be 12 years old, and right, any sex is good sex. That's this idea that is forced upon men and that we also internalize. And so a lot of us struggle with the idea, like you said, that wait, we can say no too. We don't always have to want sex too. And that's a really important conversation to have. You're right. It's mutual. Every human being, regardless of gender identity or any demographic, you have a right to consent or to not consent in whatever you do or whatever people are wanting to do with you. And it's so important that we elevate that and we normalize that. And I saw in the chat box a lot of people saying we need to start younger. And you're right. We need to start with babies and with children and normalizing and role model what consent looks like in all aspects of life, regardless of who we are, our gender or anything like that. Consent is a human element, and we can teach that, we can live that, we can respect that. And just like Leslie said, the more we do that, the more we will see change. And to Josue's point, the more we do that, we become the counter story or the counter narrative that can show other people, oh, there is more than just one way to be a man. There are ways that you can talk about consent and live that and be a positive, impactful person in your community. So it's really important that we don't just say it, but we live it too.
Yeah, I love that. That was very well said. You know, a lot of the times I keep coming back to whenever I talk to men about that, like about well, your consent's needed too. They always but then they always follow up with, well, aren't you a man? Like, yes, but also I need to give my consent, right? And so they always use that identity within manhood as a policing agent, right? Like we were talking about. Okay, we have a question. For those of you that have done prevention education, was there any time that you found most, if not all, of your group with the negative of dominant perspective, and how did you navigate that? Yeah, so great question, because it does, it happens a lot when I talk to, especially like college age young men, just because they've been so ingrained in that man box. That's basically all they know. So when you do come up to them and say, hey, no, we have a counter story to the man box, and most of the time the man box is pretty unhealthy and it's a very narrow way to see manhood, their walls come up, right? Their defenses come up and they say, whoa, 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 like, no, this is the way men should be, because that's all I know. And so how I kind of navigate that is I use my own story of manhood and my own story of breaking out of the man box to really connect with them, to say, look, like, I was pretty solidified in my man box, and I was 100% sure that I knew what kind of man I wanted to be. And unfortunately, that was what the man box was teaching us. And so I use that example of, trust me, I was where you were. our experiences may look different, but fundamentally those same rules and expectations were the same. And thankfully, someone had that conversation with me, that hard conversation to say, this isn't the way to view manhood. This is the only way to view manhood. This is an unhealthy way to view manhood. And here's how we do better. Here's how we become healthier. And so that's how I kind of take those walls down, is I just level with them and say, this is my journey. This is the benefits of that. This is where I'm at now. I'm still struggling with that, but I am overall a healthier and happier person for it. And so that's what typically works for me when I do come against a particular group that is more defensive to what we're all talking about. Sorry for such a long answer, but does anyone else have anything to add to that, or did they do something different, or anything?
Sure, I can add. I'm laughing because it happens in every room that I walk into, right? Because when you're talking to men specifically, what we're doing is challenging the foundation, right, of what they believe it is to be a man. And so when you do that, you destabilize people, right? And so when they're destabilized, you know, they're quick to defend the man box and step right back into the man box and operate from that. I think there's a way for there's a way to meet them where they're at, to meet men where they're at, without necessarily having to co-sign their BS, right? So there's a way to do this work with integrity and hold space for them, but not co-signing whatever their perspective is, or whatever the dominant perspective is that they're trying to bring into the space. And so I think one of the things that I really try to do is have them acknowledge that discomfort and sit in that discomfort, right? Because they need to sit in that discomfort to understand that that's what's going to create change, right? Because once you leave this room, I want you to keep feeling uncomfortable and feel unfinished from this conversation, because you can't pretend you don't know what I just told you, right? That there's a different way to see things. And so that's what I've used as an approach. Is just let them sit in that discomfort, you know? Like, anytime you bring up conversations around manhood, masculinity, like, you can see the room. Everybody gets really tight around the conversation. You know, but I suggest you invite that and let folks sit with that, because it's not easy conversations, right? And we just have to be honest about that. And I think that's been, in my experience, one of the best ways for men specifically to really stay at the table and stay in the conversation, and really framing it as an invitation, right, to the conversation. This is not an indictment on men. It's like, I'm inviting you to just look at things a little bit differently. And I know it's rocking your foundation. I know your head's exploding from what I'm saying, but I need you to sit here with me and talk this through, because, you know, like, there's serious impacts and lives at stake here, right? So there's a lot at stake here, and so that's, for me, an approach that has worked pretty well. So just wanted to offer that.
Yeah. Thank you. I love how you describe that, and I love how you use that as a growing factor. I do. I love it. I always say, you know, we're going to sit in the silence. Like, I'm not going to talk. I know you're uncomfortable. We're just going to sit with it. Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts before we wrap things up?
This is Jaime. I'll do one. So the work that I'm engaged in now is with guys in prison, with guys in jail, with guys in reentry, with guys who are victims of domestic violence. and then my own personal work too. And what I'm talking about is that these are all guys who are older men. We're not talking about kids. And I value the work with kids and the, what do you call it, the prevention work with youngins. But the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of guys, and usually it's because some crisis, we've created some crisis that makes us look at questions about, actually people don't start out, guys don't start out looking at questions about masculinity, but it's all tied in there, right? And so because we've always operated from within the man box, fundamentally it's the common thread through all of them. And so I don't have a question, but mostly it's just encouragement to, most of the conversation has seemed to revolve around younger people, younger adults, or youngins, and so I think it's important to also acknowledge that there's lots of us who are working with older guys and lots of us who are older guys, period, and that this conversation can be just as fruitful for older guys who have long established bad habits, as it is for youngins who maybe haven't fully established habits for a lifetime. And so I guess the nuance that I would ask for is that some of this conversation be directed at the work that's being done with older guys as well. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your input, and thank you for your work. I know at Resilience, we're starting to look at older men and how do we engage them as well. So I would love, hopefully you can join in on our other conversations and add your input, because I would love to hear what you have to say. But thank you for that. Anything else before we wrap things up? I know we're getting close to the end of our time. Cool. Okay. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for joining our second conversation. It was awesome. I'm always so excited to get together with everybody and talk about these things. And so thank you for your vulnerability, your openness. And if you want any more information, please feel free to email me. It's seths@resiliencemi.org. And so, yeah, thank you again for joining in on this conversation. Next week, we are going to be talking about healthy relationships. So just the next step in our conversation. So we started at man box, we looked at consent. Now we're going to look at healthy relationships. How do we get there? What do they look like? What do unhealthy relationships look like? How do we communicate the things we need in relationships? And so just like consent, we're going to be talking about romantic relationships, but also workplace relationships, friendships. So yeah, hopefully you can join in on that. And thanks again. I appreciate all your time. I appreciate all your feedback, and I appreciate all your voices. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have a wonderful weekend. Awesome. Thanks again.
Everyone.
Thanks, everybody.